What's up, dads? Your boy Big Dave Martell back with another episode of Culture Dad's Age of Sword Set. You know, Imperial Press just dropped a really cool book called Steelstorm II by a guy that everybody's familiar with, Mr. T777, and we have him with us here today. What's up, fellas?
How you doing? Thanks for hosting me as always, man, and thanks for the plug.
Yeah, it's good to have you on here. We had you for an interview with Dave a few episodes ago, maybe a dozen episodes ago, something like that. But now we got the whole gang here, and Steelstorm II just dropped. So this is I figured it was a good opportunity to chat a little bit about that, sort of dig into look a little bit under the hood and maybe into some of the writing process, and also maybe because there's an interesting backstory, I think, to the world building in this book. So, Thomas, why don't you tell us a little bit about that? That'd be a good way into it. Maybe you could tell the audience a bit about what motivated you to write this now series, because there's 2 entries. Can you just tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think people have gleaned who, especially people who read some of my longer form stuff, on the Substack and elsewhere. I was very much a Cold War kid, and if you grew up in the 80s, the kind of specter of nuclear war it just kind of loomed over everything. Not any, not like the COVID nonsense did, and people didn't act hysterical about it, but it like everything was kind of inundated with that potentiality, and it was very strange, man, and it particularly because, my dad was very engaged with foreign policy oriented stuff, like in that, like discussion between him and my mom, kind of orbited around such things, like more so than I think in some other kids' houses, because I mean, generally, despite whatever anybody tells you, and it's even the same today, despite how much people bandy about things that changed, if you live in a 2-parent household, kind of like your dad's profession, that kind of determines the fortunes of the family, not just in material terms, but socially. So that's kind of proverbially, like what dinner table conversation orbits around. And so like Cold War stuff was just kind of, you were in the early 80s, you were surrounded by that no matter what, in like wherever you were, like in any kind of conceptual space. But, for me, like even like within the kind of cloister of the family home, there was no reprieve from it. So this was just always on my mind, and it kind of the only kind of nightmares I had as a kid were nuclear war nightmares, and I mean, inspired in part by stuff like the Terminator and like, things like The Day After, which for those that don't know was this film that made a huge impact, and even President Reagan at the time spoke about it. It was about it was about a general nuclear war breaking out between NATO and Warsaw Pact, and it covered the experience of survivors in Lawrence, Kansas. It's really horrified people. And as a little kid, the UK had a similar film called Threads, which is in some ways way more kind of brutal and was even more frightening at the time. But this kind of stuff was always on my mind. And when I was about 12, 13, like as kind of perestroika was setting in and things, I started writing science fiction stories, and they focused around they focused around this creature that was quite literally like a human mind trapped in a machine. And I got the idea in part from Johnny Got His Gun, which, I mean, I think people remember, especially guys who are into metal, like when Metallica dropped the One video, that was kind of the first exposure a lot of people had to that film, which, was based on the book by Dalton Trumbo. And like later in life, I read the book, but I found that to be, that was another thing that kind of horrified me, was that prospect. So I started writing stories about this creature that, he was, a human mind, ensconced in this machine, that was supposed to be a war machine, and he wasn't supposed to have his human consciousness anymore. But by some horrible accident of fate, his human consciousness, remained or it was rediscovered. And, he came to realize, the horror of his situation. And I started writing just kind of like short stories in that vein. And just kind of throughout my teenage years, like I built an entire universe around that. And that character became Zartax. That's basically was the kind of seed of Steelstorm. And then, as I grew up and stuff, I always wrote, similar kind of stories in notebooks and things, but I didn't really show them to anybody. But then as time went on and, many, many, many years later, I'm talking, in like, the late 20-teens and into 2020, when I got back online and things, I started thinking like, well, I'm not getting any younger. I'd really kind of like to try my hand at, actually turning this into, something viable as, and marketable, but that also, carries with it, a kind of meaningful, like philosophical sensibility. So I sat down to write it, and I thought, well, I don't want to take the next 2.5 years and write a 400-page book that maybe nobody will read, because I'd feel like a fool, like dedicating that kind of time and effort to it. And like, obviously, I mean, nobody writes science fiction, particularly of a philosophical bent, because they're interested in making money or capturing clout. But I don't want to, eat a loss on some, on some like mass, effort at writing a novel that nobody's gonna read. So I decided, as an experiment, well, let's kind of serialize it and see where that goes. And the first Steelstorm novella was actually tremendously successful for something like that. But then I realized too, I mean, and to your point, Mike, you helped me kind of come to this conclusion. People these days, everybody laments, quote, short attention spans, but I think the serial format actually is. I'm glad to see that kind of come back into favor, and I'm hoping with this brand I can kind of develop it into somewhere between, like a graphic novel and like a serialized, conventional novel, like moving forward. I mean, there's a lot of potential, but that's basically the origin of Steelstorm. And that's why like it's broken into like a serialized format, and as of now, I intend there to be 5 of them. But, the response has been overwhelmingly positive, and that's really fantastic. Not just because it makes me feel like, what I'm doing is worthwhile, but I hope that inspires other people to, in similar projects. A lot of people, they're like embarrassed to admit they write fiction or something, but there's, it's not one or the other. Like I said, I mean, I'm primarily like a revisionist author and a guy who writes on theoretical topics. I'm not like a fiction author. I mean, science fiction's always kind of been a domain of like weirdos who weren't really, like literary types. But, I think especially too on the right, science fiction has always been kind of either value neutral or like quasi right wing. Like I've argued that point with people. Like nonsense like Star Wars and Star Trek is not really science fiction. It's kind of like the pop culture like interpretation of it. But it's not. Science fiction has always been subcultural, and again, it's always guys like Heinlein obviously kind of fall clearly on the right, or at least what passed for the right in the Cold War. But even people like Arthur C. Clarke, they always, who I think is kind of underappreciated these days, especially by younger guys. But science fiction has always been it's always been a viable kind of counterfactual conceptual medium, to explore political ideas and stuff in a way that's not, it's kind of dry and pedantic. So yeah, that's basically how Steelstorm came to pass. It's
nice.
Yeah.
No, it's doing really well. The second one, first one was pretty much a smash. Like, not to give too much away about like what goes on behind the scenes, but really it was when the release of Steelstorm 1 in, I think it was September of 2021, and a few releases kind of around that was really when Imperium Press started to really take off. So that was like you were a big part of that, so thank you. And
no, it's awesome.
It was very well received, and I think one of the reasons why it was really well received is that you're right, science fiction is a great medium to explore political themes. And I have a theory. We've actually talked about this, you and I, before on a stream, but I'll mention it here as well later on, that I think that sci-fi is something that is actually inherently right-wing and reactionary. But what I wanted to say about Steelstorm is that the political content in this series is really very much under the surface. This is not a story or a narrative that you're going to read and you're going to say, oh, well, this is, it's like an allegory for something that's, it's just trying to like put across a political message. The political themes are very much below the surface and subtle, and it doesn't beat you over the head with like right-wing politics at all. Although it's there. It's there, and especially the mythic qualities of it and everything, and the backstory and whatnot. And of course, some of it's it's quasi-historical because a lot of it's based in the Cold War era and before. But it doesn't beat you over the head with its political content. I think that's really good, and I think that's really effective. Like if the goal, which I'm sure it's not, but if the goal is to get your point across as like, here's what I believe, and this is this is the politics you should adopt, then if that's what you want to do, then you absolutely would want to do that in a way that's very subtle kind of thing. Because I mean, some of the fiction, sometimes you read a little bit of flash fiction from the right, and sometimes it can be very clumsy in the way that it puts these themes across. But the best stuff is really subtle.
Yeah, Thomas, you mentioned
go ahead,
you mentioned about how like sci-fi was like the realm of weirdos, and you also mentioned about like big novel size and everything like that. And you could see, like, I'm a guy that goes all the way back. You mentioned these authors being right wing. Man, we published the Bizarre Archives. We published Man in the 25th Century, which is the first two novellas from Philip Francis Nolan about Buck Rogers. It was Buck Rogers before Buck Rogers. And this is a story that's literally, it's nothing like the TV show from the 80s where he kind of like travels the galaxy and smooches babes and is like this Flash Gordon type character. Man in the 25th Century, i.e., Armageddon 2419 and Airlords of Han, is like this post-apocalyptic world where the Chinese are taking over and like replacing people, and it's like about the fall of the American race, which is like it's really problematic. The reason we published it is because a lot of main publishers won't touch it anymore. A lot of this, you mentioned Heinlein, guys like a lot of these early sci-fi authors, Wells. There's just so many of them that Jack Vance you could throw in there, even though he was more of a fantasist. But this early science fiction stuff, number one, it didn't come in these gigantic novels, right? In fact, fiction for most of its existence until about the 70s was primarily, I'm sure everybody remembers Ace paperbacks, right? Ace paperbacks, these little tiny paperbacks you got for $1 that were like 120 pages. So short form has always been the fiction medium. And it wasn't until like the 70s when guys like Asimov and stuff came onto the scene, and they made it into, they started organizations like SIFWA, which now, if you look at SIFWA, it's completely populated and infected with like pedophiles and the weirdest kind of creatures. But before that, before the 70s, science fiction and these types of, I guess you could say, fantasy proper, these types of fantasy style of writing. This was for bros. It was for chads. It was written in short form, and it didn't go into it didn't become these big gigantic novels until they started like writing them in order to sell more expensive books and make these big long series and everything like that. Right. And this is when the reader got alienated, in my view. This is when it got weird and gay and stuff. And you mentioned Star Trek, right? Star Trek and Star Wars. And don't get me wrong, I like the first Star Wars movie. I grew up with it. I'm a fan, but it's not true sci-fi. Star Trek is definitely not true sci-fi. Star Trek is what I call progressive sci-fi, which is just of science fiction. If you go back, you read the guys I mentioned, Heinlein And even like Frank Herbert, even though he's a little bit more of a later, it comes in a little bit later, is not about like, oh, in the future science is going to solve all of our problems, and we're going to go out and make peace, and there's no struggle and all this kind of stuff. It is demonstrating man's nervousness with. In regards to his relationship with technology and like modernity, right?
Go ahead. Well, no, that's also why in stuff like Star Trek, it's not even like I made the point of people too who like argue like Star Trek apologetics. Like Star Trek, it's just like accidental. Like Star Trek takes place in the future. Like Happy Days takes place in the 50s. It's just like this accidental setting. It's like everybody's a human. Everybody speaks English. Like even when Kirk and Spock and McCoy go to different planets, it's like, oh, this is like the 1920s planet. This is the Third Reich planet. I mean, it's like not it. It's not even like it's not like it would be good if the progressive kind of social propaganda was intelligently insinuated. But it's just like skinned like with, oh, this is in space, because that was kind of like what was considered cool, and sort of like the kind of like immediately post Kennedy 1960s, like it's not even. So yeah, that's why it's
kind of like boring ass writing that's just crudely handled. That was kind of my impression. I only ever watched Star Trek when I was growing up in the 90s. So I don't know what it was really like before that, but it just always rubbed me the wrong way. It always I didn't like the sort of, I don't know, milk toast and like boring kind of aesthetic. And I guess now I could recognize that as a progressive aesthetic, but it just seemed like, even stuff like X-Files was just like so much more interesting and kind of like edgy and a little bit more intelligent and everything. And Star Trek was just really try hard and
well, it's one of the reasons people like Alien so much, and the original Alien is a really great film. I like it too. But one of the reasons it made such a huge impact is because it dealt with the reality of things that are actually emergent, relating to technology. Like aside from the horror of this like alien parasite attacking this crew of workers, like space travel is uncomfortable, it's difficult, it's dirty, it's like hard on the human body. Like the people in Alien are always exhausted and banged up, and but like in Star Trek, it's just like, oh, in the future, there's warp drive. We can just go anywhere, and everything's clean, and everything just works right. I mean, it's like something. Yeah. It's like the way a little kid might. I mean, aside from the social propaganda, it's like the way a little kid might think about like, there's would like conceptualize things in the future. Just kind of this like, in practical terms, like just there's no problems. I mean, that's like why is that compelling? Like the whole reason, to read or consume science fiction is because it presents, it presents scenarios that actually, could happen, or alternatively, even if it's more in the science fantasy vein, it kind of deals with like challenges of, being a flesh and blood human and trying to navigate, an increasingly technological world, or trying to survive in environments like space that are totally hostile to life, like it. If traveling in space is just kind of like being in your living room couch, like, okay, why is that compelling? So yeah, that's also why I think I made the point before, the science fiction suffered it, like mainstream science fiction when the Cold War ended. There were so many guys, like Jerry Pournelle, first among them, I mean, who actually worked on like SDI, and he was a big part of the committee on the present danger, in the 80s. There's a lot of guys during the Cold War who were insinuated into national defense policy, actually writing science fiction, because it was a medium for them to kind of deal with these challenges of the arms race and, like emergent deeper parodies relating to AI and things. So I think mainstream sci-fi suffered after the Cold War, but honestly, another reason I started writing Steelstorm for publication is because it's like, a lot of this stuff, I mean, it seems kind of on the nose to talk about, but, a lot of the stuff, like a lot of stuff in like the cyberpunk genre, like actually came true, like a lot of the, like,
Neuromancer.
Yeah. And like, now that we're like well into the 21st century, like a lot of the stuff that was speculated about is actually emergent, so I mean, that should give that should provide a lot of fertile ground for inspiration, so yeah, people definitely are still thirsty for like decent sci-fi, man. So yeah, that's something that, you know, kind of inspired me to write it now. So yeah.
A lot of people, when they look at these like technocrats, right? You look at these like Silicon Valley programmers and guys that are doing all this kind of stuff, right? A lot of people look at them and like say, "Oh, well, they're Marxists, or they're neoliberals, or et cetera, et cetera." And you know, maybe they are in some sense. But if you they say this, like there's programmers and engineers at Microsoft that have said this, you know, Twitter, blah blah blah, like all Google, like all the big tech firms. If you go up and you ask these guys, like, and many of them have said this, what is your like inspiration for doing this? A lot of them will say they read Neuromancer in college, or they read Snow Crash in college, and this is what shaped their worldview and their motivations for creating their technology. And you know, which is pretty dumb, because if you read these books, these are clearly warnings about like the horrible outcomes if this technology comes to fruition. But they like looked at it as like a playbook, unfortunately.
Like
But
meta, like Facebook meta now, like kind of thing.
Yeah.
It's almost yeah.
Yeah,
No,
you think Zuckerberg was reading Das Kapital and like all this kind of no, this guy was reading science fiction. People really, really underestimate the impact science fiction has had on our society.
But old
yeah,
Zook was kind of not getting it though, because a lot of it is very technology skeptical, and like it's like it seems like some of them were like decided, oh well, we want to actually implement this dystopian vision for some godforsaken reason, but this technology skepticism, I just wanted to mention this before the conversation moves on to other topics, because we've been talking about it. The fact that, like, you know, the best sci-fi is pretty much like technology skeptical or whatever. This goes back right to the beginning, right? Like to H.G. Wells' Time Machine. Like this was a book that changed everything for me when I read it in high school. I had never really thought about evolution as it like applies to humans, or at least like humans now. Like it's the kind of thing where you kind of think of like, okay, well, you know, we evolved from apes and like that's all over now, and we've just sort of like assumed our final form. H.G. Wells pushes it into the future and says, well, no, this is what could happen, and it ain't good, right? Like necessarily it's not always good. And something like Arthur C. Clarke's 2001, I have not read the book, but like I read the movie as a kind of parable of like what could go wrong with technology. I think it's actually a myth, an anti-tech myth, which a lot of people I think would balk at, but that's the way I read it. But anyway, this reactionary quality is also part of what it makes it mythic. Like it's reactionary in that it's skeptical about progress and technology. Sci-fi says, you know, progress ain't all it's cracked up to be, kind of thing. It's almost like well, this gets into sort of like another thing, but it's a story, but it also sort of is an imperative or a command that says, like, careful with that axe, Eugene, right? Like it says, you need to be skeptical of this technology stuff. Boring ass sci-fi like Star Trek is just science kind of like jerking itself off and patting itself on the back. But it's boring, and it's very superficial, right? The best sci-fi has this deeply reactionary, mythic quality to it. I mean mythic in the sort of Sorelian sense, but yeah, we'll come back to that.
Well, yeah, it's also about the search for God, you know, I mean, for better or worse. And I mean, maybe that leads to, and I mean, even if that leads to, I mean, that itself is a frightening prospect. I mean, that's one of the things that's, you know, that's the whole reason why stuff like Star Trek fails. It's like, okay, so, you know, you traverse light years and what do you find? Oh, there's just like people exactly like us, but they've got pointy ears or something. Like like the best sci-fi, like, you know, I was talking to Jay Burden. He's a good dude. He's like he's got a podcast and stuff, and he's a big fan of the Forever War. And you know, I won't give away the plot to people who haven't read it, but one of the issues with the Forever War is that, you know, this genocidal war happens with these creatures that, you know, who are in like the Proxima Centauri system or something. Like one's like fast and like traveling as possible, and this war breaks out because like the two species don't know how to communicate with each other. You know, it's not even like it's not even like there had to be, you know, a hostile contact, but how would you even communicate with an extraterrestrial species? You know, like that, like questions like that are what's interesting about sci-fi. You know, like I said, like the search for God. And like interestingly, like 2001 is an incredibly dope movie. And its counterpart was the film version of Solaris. That was a Soviet movie based on the Tarkovsky novel. But Soviet era science fiction is really interesting. And despite the, kind of official line of like state atheism, it was very like God centric in a way that you would not think so. But yeah, that's what's special about science fiction, is that it's a way to address these things in a way that's like not corny, and that can be profound and is generally respectful and better treatments of the subject matter. Like that's another thing too. Aside from the fact that, like I said, I think that people are thirsty for serious science fiction. It's one of those mediums that, we need to reclaim because it belongs to us. It doesn't belong to progressives and like weirdos and fucking perverts and like, and also like, like people, there's a lot of pop culture like nobody should care about because it's just like garbage, and it's like, I'm the first person to say like, if you're a partisan, like you shouldn't even be fucking with that because it's stupid. But science fiction is one of these things we definitely need to like plant a flag on and claim it as ours, because it's actually an important medium. I just wanted to insinuate that.
Yeah, I would argue that science fiction is mythopoetic. You know what I mean? It's kind of like it is a style, it's an art form, a style of storytelling that is unique to our epoch of modernity, post-modernity, etc. It's really only appears here. Where else would it appear? So to like kind of like abandon it because a bunch of got their hands on it in the 70s and slithered their way in. And here's the thing with these guys, right? They just trash everything. Like people that are pure liberals, they just trash every art form because they can't fathom fantasy. They literally can't. And if you look at, let's talk about like just the genre of fantasy, they do the same exact thing. You go and you like go pick up some old school sword and sorcery from the pulp era, or even like a little bit later. This stuff is awesome, right? You have like there's tension between weird primeval races. There's dark magic. There's heroism. And it's very inspired by the source material of our ancestors, Beowulf, Eddas, the Odyssey, Iliad, etc., etc. It's very much like drawing from that and uses that. Now, when you get into like the 70s and then the 80s, and now there's a lot of great stuff in the 70s and 80s. Don't get me wrong. I could point to probably 20 off the top of my head that were great. But when you get into this era and into the 90s and 2000s, when fantasy and science fiction like really kind of fall out of the literary sphere and only maintain interesting qualities in film and graphic novels and stuff. It's you look at the fantasy and they look at the end result of it now. They do the same exact thing that you see in Star Trek. They literally, because of anything outside of their universal truth, if anything exists outside of their perceived universal truth, is like it can't be real. So they can only fathom what is within that. So what do? They can't think of a fantasy world where there's like tension between different species and all of this kind of dark magic. They create what I call Seattle with elves, right? They create these like kitchen sink settings where there's all of these different races living in these like globo metropolises together. Magic is everywhere. Magic solves every problem and everybody gets along. And then now it's gotten so ridiculous. It's like some furry, gross stuff where you have like lizard men falling in love with goblins, and they're like, it's like bizarre and trash, and like nobody wants to read it because it sucks. And on top of it, they print them into these gigantic tomes like they're fucking Tolkien, right? Thinking people are going to buy them. And then they throw their hands up. Oh, nobody's buying books, blah, blah, blah. Let me tell you, the Bizarre Archives, we publish sci-fi and fiction. I can't keep the shit in stock. I sell out. Like I get new stuff, I sell it out. People still like this shit. You just got to write it the way that the original guys did with like what we're talking about.
No, and it's weird. It's weird how it's weird how they favor like just kind of like voluminous like length for its own sake. Like to your point, like Harlan Ellison and a lot of these dudes who wrote like the post weird fiction era, but before kind of printing became super cheap. So before the advent of the paperback, Like, and one of the reasons people would read like nudie magazines like Playboy or Gallery is because they'd serialize a lot of science fiction, and yeah, people, the conventional format for sci-fi is the serial format. Fantasy is kind of a different story, but these kinds of paint by numbers garbage authors, like, why are they dropping like 900-page books? Like, why, like, you're not getting paid by the word, so like, what's the point of that? Just like for its own sake? Like, I don't.
Ironically, machines will replace them. Let us hope, because it seems like machines write them already. Well,
I mean, practically, I think. Well, I mean, I think. First of all, there's a team of ghostwriters under all those brands. Like, I can't give you an example of like a specific, because I don't know like who the big like kind of pop science fiction or pop fantasy authors are, but there's a team of authors just like writing those things under a brand. Like, I'm explaining to people who love Stephen King, first of all, it's obvious Stephen King's wife like wrote a lot of that shit. Like, no man is writing stuff like Carrie or Dolores Claiborne, number one. Like, number two, like, once he started selling screenplays, like the early 80s, like, he had like half a dozen, like hack wannabes, who were trying to break out, like, writing his stuff as Stephen King. Like, it's not even. So I don't even know why people become like loyal to these. It's like they were loyal to a brand, not a specific author. But
yeah,
it's But yeah, these like fantasy books that are just kind of like obviously like fourth rate like Tolkien imitation stuff. That are like 900 pages. There's probably like 5 guys or like 3 guys and like 2 broads like in grad school for literature, like writing that crap because they're hoping they'll get noticed. And then some editor just kind of like cobbles it together and like smooths out the inconsistency in the narrative, and then bam, okay, I've got an 800-page book on like the genderqueer elves of like wherever, like it, like it sounds like I'm being funny, but I think that's what the process is anymore. So yeah. It almost is a machine writing it.
Yeah, and you wouldn't be. It's all completely astroturfed. I should have brought it up for this, but there is an author where you mentioned one of the pop authors that's like going around is this big fat black lesbian called N.K. Jemisin, and she is like fucking terrible. Like if you try to read her books, like they're just like unreadable. They're just like, it's just fucking terrible. She's not good. And they give her, she's got like, 5 Hugo Awards and Nebula Awards. They just like throw awards at her, regard her as the greatest sci-fi fantasy writer of all time. And like all like better than Frank Herbert, better than Tolkien. they literally astroturf this lady, and she's fucking terrible. And the entirety of her identity is like subverting H.P. Lovecraft. She is like, so everything out of her mouth is something like she just wants to paint white men as like cosmic horror entities. That's her whole fucking thing, is she's mad at Lovecraft, her whole thing, but she's like not good. And it's
what's
like
really weird too, like this has happened for a long time with journalists and stuff, where they where they're they get replaced by a ghostwriter who's like completely at odds with the ideas of the original author. Like, there's this guy named Kent Anderson. He was a Vietnam vet, and when a lot of that like really kind of dark like kind of war fiction was coming out of the 70s from the Vietnam era, he wrote this book called Sympathy for the Devil, which is a really great book. And then a few years later, he wrote a sequel called Night Dog. Then he just kind of disappeared and like kind of like withdrew from the public eye. Well, a few years ago in like 2016, suddenly this book drops that's supposedly a sequel to these 2 books by Kent Anderson. So I pick it up, and it's about this guy who's a cop, and he falls in love with this black lady and then realizes that he was wrong to be a racist. Like, I'm not kidding you. And it's like obvious, like Kent Anderson had nothing to do with this book, and it's obvious too, like a woman wrote it, and it's creepy. It's like it's almost like pod people or something. It's like they'll literally go into the catalog, these publishers they'll find an author who either like never filled a contract with them, or they still have like rights to his name. They'll like hire like some like Mexican lesbian to write like a woke book, then they'll like slap this guy's name on it and like try and publish it like as that as if it's as if it's truly his work product. And this has become like more and more like common because I raised that kind of on some of my social media platforms. Like all these guys are like, oh yeah, you know, such and such author, or like I picked up his book and like he went totally woke, man. I'm like, dude, it's not him. It's like his, you know, this is very much a thing. It's very like late Soviet or something. Like, yeah.
Tell me your genre is dying without tell me your genre is dying. Like, this is why we need to reclaim these spaces, you know, like, because they've basically been abandoned, at least in terms of good content and everything like that. Like, obviously people still want this stuff. People still have a craving for it. There's a need for sci-fi. I mean, it scratches an itch that has pretty much always been there. I mean, there's very early precedents for these genres even in the ancient world and everything like that. And it just seems to me, anyway, I'm not like this. Sci-fi is not my genre in terms of like something I know, like, you know, a ton about or whatever. I know a lot more about the early era of it and everything, but even still, it seems like this is something that has been like pretty much abandoned and left to the wolves. So it's really good to see that, you know, Dave is doing what he's doing and bringing to light new authors. That Steelstorm is making a splash and an impact in our scene and everything like that, because really this stuff belongs to us, and especially because it's got that mythic quality.
Yeah, and you raised the point when we first went live, like way too much. There's way too much right wing fiction that's just like on the nose, like ideological screed. It's either pedantic or it clubs the reader over the head, you know, with some kind of like policy platform. Like that was the problem with stuff like the Turner Diaries. Now, I mean, in its defense, Turner Diaries was serialized and a lot of like pro-gun zines and stuff, like and a lot of, you know, and I mean, so it's like, okay, so I'm hip to the fact that, you know, it was supposed to be, you know, kind of like more like nakedly political than like a lot of kind of straightforward fiction. But even kind of like in like the social media age, like a lot of the dudes who I'm sure are like good guys, like I'm not like putting shade on them and their motivations, who like drop you know, who drop fiction like in our political faction. It's just like on the nose, like, oh, here's a book about, you know, like these immigrants like raping and killing everybody. You're like, you know, here's a book about how like in the future, like, you know, feminists rule everything and like cut your balls off when you're bored. It's like, bro, like nobody wants to read that shit. And plus,
tell a good story. Yeah, I'll tell you guys. Real quick, I'm sorry. I read tons of submissions because of who I am. Like, pretty much everybody that submits is at least right of center. The number one reason that I reject stories is because they're too fucking political. Like, if I read your story and it comes off as propaganda and it's too on the nose, rejected immediately. I don't give a shit. Like, here's the deal. If you are right wing, if you are a traditionalist, if you are a nationalist, whatever you are, and you want, don't go out with the goal of creating like right wing art. Create good art as a right winger. There's a big difference.
Oh yeah, no.
Yeah, regardless of you know, what you are consciously writing, what you believe in your worldview will be in your art. Just create this shit. Now, I do have before we go too far, I have a question for both of you guys. I got both of you big brains on here. We kind of glanced over it, but there's this thing, like we talked about how the libtoads, they love these gigantic verbose, too many words things, and if you go and you read their like social science crap, it's full of these like made up terminology and word salads, and they love this too much words stuff. They don't have brevity as one of their instincts. Why do you guys think that is?
I mean, I think I made the point the other day on one of the podcasts that there's this need of liberals, and there always has been, to kind of justify their ontology in terms of science, because that's really all they have, you know. Because like when you strip away culture, when you strip away theology, when you strip away kind of the mystique of things, and like really all you have really your only claim to legitimacy is that, well, the present is superior to everything that came before. So everything that came before was some kind of hell, you know, of where people's dignity was you know was violated, and you know life was just painful and torturous, and you know it was conditions of abject shortage, and you know so but you know but now like everything is better, you know, even if it's not ideal, it's better. And they're only they claim that they're the arbiters of reason in social policy and in values therein. Like this begins actually with a Hobbes. Like Hobbes wasn't a liberal in the terms we think of it, and he was a brilliant political theorist. Like probably he was one of the most brilliant minds of the modern era. But his ontology, like what he posited man as a political animal, as being, you know, this kind of like isolated integer, you know, who like enters into affiliation with others out of self-interest. Like that's basically like the liberal ontology, the brass tacks of it. But
yeah, like he was an absolutist, like an absolutist monarchist, but he was a stepping stone on the way to liberalism, and he was criticized heavily by other absolutists for this. Exactly.
But like fast forward, like the whole kind of like liberal ontology is like, oh well, we're resolving problems because, you know, we're forcing all these like arcane practices and all these like irrational passions to be subjugated to reason, you know. So but they're not people who actually understand like science, and they're not people who actually understand, you know, kind of like the Aristotelian underpinnings of like the Western intellectual tradition. Like, so they're like bad rationalists, but they think if they throw enough like jargon around that, you know, that'll somehow like validate it. And plus a lot of this stuff's just like made up. Like if you go to like a women's studies department, or you go to like some critical theory heavy college social sciences department, you know, they don't really have an intellectual canon. So if like basically they'll just like throw as many kind of like nonsense terms in, and it's the way kind of like a cringe like midwit person would think, you know, something sounds smart or intelligent or like scholarly. So I mean that's part of it, I think. There was this one guy who wrote an essay called Fashionable Nonsense, where he like submitted some paper and he just like literally like made up terms, and like and it was like absolute nonsense. And he like submitted it to some Canadian university, and they like published it as like a valid like peer reviewed paper. And he's like, actually this paper is meaningless because I just like made up these terms. And like if you decode what I'm saying that like my methodology was like garbage, you know, and like and like it. So I mean, this is like an ongoing. This is something that goes like way back. This is like in the early '90s, but like yeah, I mean that's kind of my take on it. It's like intellectual poverty, and you know people being fixated on appearances without actually understanding like what underlies those appearances. You know, so I'm going to use like sciencey words, and I'm going to use smart sounding stuff. You know, like I think that's what it is. I'm constantly coming across. Like, yeah. Go ahead.
Sorry, no, I just want to take a crack at this one here, because I think there's actually a few things to say about like why the left is so much into word salad. The first is really, I'm just kind of agreeing with your point here, Thomas, is that they kind of worship techniques. They worship the technical. They worship science. And this is really something kind of interesting, because at one point, science and theology were not two different things. But since Francis Bacon, at least, science has kind of tried to divorce the technical from the theological. So it's like, you know, originally, I mean, like this is in the early modern period, something like astronomy began to diverge from astrology, right? And, you know, I'm not saying let's go back to astrology necessarily, but the fact is that this is something that has a theological basis. At the end of the day, liberalism is basically a theology. It's a political theology. And the worship of the technical is a big part of that. And so in a way, this is just kind of something that is done for fashion, because, you know, philosophy is taken to be a technical discipline. It is in some ways, it's not in other ways, but it's just seen where like you have to if you're not doing it in a technical way, then you're doing it kind of wrong, right? And this is sort of seen on both sides of the divide, because in modern philosophy, there's basically sort of like two schools or genres, really. There's continental philosophy and there's analytic philosophy. Analytic philosophy is the one where it's not like word salad. It's very straightforward, and it's very prosaic, and it's very much more interesting in a lot of ways. But at the same time, it's very much, it wants to be a science. It's a real wannabe sort of science. And on the other side, you've got the continental, which is kind of grounded. It historically descends from German idealism, really. That's kind of its lineage. And German idealism was extremely jargon heavy, and in some ways kind of like a forerunner to this word salad. Like you get things like Immanuel Kant and especially Hegel and even Heidegger, who is kind of interesting in that he coined a lot of his own like phraseology and all of this, but it's taken to be a jargon heavy genre philosophy. And of course, even the like post-structuralist and postmodernist stuff like that the Sokal affair was all part of is really sort of branches of philosophy and everything. But I think ultimately the main reason why this postmodern shit is so word salad heavy is that it doesn't actually at the end of the day land on anything real. There's a wonderful quote from the Wittgenstein's Tractatus, and it's not actually something he wrote. It's the little motto that he put at the beginning of the book, written by somebody else, and it says something like, "Anything that isn't like just roaring and rumbling and blustering that at the end of the day is actually real can be summarized in 3 words." And I think that this is something very true. Nothing in the academy that has anything to do with feminism or post-colonial studies or anything like that can be summarized in 3 words, at least not in a way that is remotely plausible. And that the reason why is because it's not true, quite simply. So I think that's kind of ultimately the answer to that.
Yeah, I have this meme in my head because I'm very interested in art as a whole. I love weird stuff. You know what I mean? I love weird paintings and weird fiction and music. It all kind of comes together. I think it's like all in the same kind of category. But just as like exercise, I like to go and check out what like academies and pretentious museum societies are doing and everything. And they're all just completely enamored with this like pomo like word salad garbage. So I have this like meme in my head where there's just like this modern art garbage, like just like a pile of broken toasters and some Fanoik just like farted paint out of his anus on it, and they write this gigantic fucking 5-word essay explaining it with all of these fucking word salads. And then on the other side there's like a Chad standing in front of a Frank Frazetta piece, and he just says based. Because it's like, because that's like what it is. It's like they make this crap that is like not good. It's like, and in me, I'm kind of a grug brain. I like look at it, I'm like, no, that's sick, that's dope, or it's not, or it's gay and cringe and sucks. And it's just like,
and it's also, I think a lot of these, despite what they say, people who ascribe, people who ascribe to kind of like woke identity politics. They're very, very self-conscious of the fact that they're inferior in basic ways, and they're constantly trying to convince you that they really are smart and that, they really are, like intellectual, whatever that means. Like, and that's why what's fascinating to me too, like in addition to the fact that, like this kind of pitiable jargon that doesn't actually describe anything, it's also applied to like kind of the most banal and like, frankly, like vulgar topics. It's like the reason why people like Hegel and Heidegger, they were trying to describe things that often like defy description. Like what is human consciousness, or like what is the historical process, or like what is it to be aware of time in some like human sense. Like you take that, take like the middling college professor like in whatever like social science discipline. is like literally talking about like guys having anal sex with each other. That's like his big weighty topic that he's like trying to decipher. You know, like the meaning of like ass sex or something. Like it sounds like I'm being funny. If that's literally what these fucking people like spend their time.
They're basically they're just edging each other. This is like softcore porn for these people that they're just kind of like edging each other. You like by just like shooting euphemisms down each other's throat. That's it. Like this is a way for them to talk about titillating subjects without coming out and just like talking about them, right? So you can imagine this like tiny little boner sort of growing as they're writing these essays, because it's basically softcore porn. And it's kind of like in a lot of cases anyway.
What a bunch of weirdos.
No, exactly. And it's, I mean, people who like imagination, I mean, they're always gonna, I mean, I'm aside the fact that they're like, you know, literal perverts and that they're small-minded. The small-mindedness is kind of the key to understanding like why their stuff is so kind of like insufferable, because there's really, at the end of the day, there's nothing to it, and they're just they're trying to imitate the works of actually superior people, but without getting like the essence of it. You know, like simpletons always discern form in some kind of incomplete sense, but they never discern essence. So they're just constantly trying to like imitate form. And it's like, oh, I'm gonna like air out like my grievance, you know, my petty social grievances, but I'm gonna take that like sciencey, like smart language, and you know, that'll make it legitimate, or that'll make me seem, you know, like more than I am. I mean, I think some of it's just that simple, because these people are not There are guys. No, go ahead.
Sorry, no, you go ahead. It's fine.
There are guys you find, like I think of them as descendants of like Paul Nietzsche and stuff, like the guys, you know, the Pride for New American Century types. Like these guys are smart. They're very bad people, and their values are totally perverted. But they are intelligent, you know, and that's one of the reasons why they're dangerous. Like, when we're talking about the kind of, you know, typical left-wing academic, like even in the Ivy Leagues these days, like these people are not smart people. There's not like thoughtful people. Like that's why what populates their imagination is, you know, like A, like identity grievance, and B, like weird sex stuff. You know, like you're talking about people who are very, very simple of mind and spirit. That's all.
Yeah, and I mean they are smart. They're smart in certain ways, but they're also kind of stupid in other ways. Like you'll find a lot of times, like they will never debate you, and they will never debate anyone that really knows their shit. And it's not because they don't want to give you a platform, although that's kind of part of it, but it's because they know that they can't actually defend their ideas in plain speech. And, you know, without patting ourselves on the back too much about, you know, how they're wrong and we're right, there's an interesting phenomenon that's going on here with that. Basically, what they're doing is they're sort of carving out a discrete epistemic domain for themselves. So they're basically carving out a different language, and the language of that you are using to describe your concepts and frame the world actually has a lot to do with how you see the world. They're seeing the world in a different way. They have a different set of concepts. And this actually colors their sort of vision. This is kind of like, and this is something, it's a wider phenomenon that's happening in the wider world. It's what's been called the epistemic divorce. So you basically, you know, since like Trump, but especially since the 2020 US election, you saw this kind of explosion of fact checkers on both sides of politics who like can't even agree on what the facts actually are. We're starting to bifurcate at least into two categories, right and left, or progressive and reactionary, whatever you want to say, where we kind of live in different epistemic and even like linguistic worlds. We don't start from the same assumptions, and we kind of don't even speak the same language. And this is part of what's happening in the academy, is basically these people are starting to drift off and become almost like different humanoids in some way, where they think differently. They start from different assumptions. It's almost like a cultural, it's just like it's starting to splinter kind of thing. And actually, I regard this as a very good development, because basically the cultural hegemony that like liberalism and the Cold War and the end of history sort of enjoyed is starting to break down now. We are starting to inhabit different epistemic domains. And you're seeing this. Yeah, I mean, you see this in the radical right, you know, with our meme speak and our sort of like, you know, internet slang, and they see this with like BAP, even the way it spells words a little bit differently and everything like that. This is really interesting stuff that's starting to happen. It's like this global monoculture is starting to actually splinter into like, yeah, again, a kind of like, you know, diversity of nationalities in some ways, but it's like diversity of propositional nationalities of like what you believe and everything. And so this is part of why you're seeing this like insane amount of like gobbledygook in the academy, is that's starting to become its own linguistic domain.
No, that's huge,
like
man. Yeah,
that they live in.
Yeah, the bifurcation of conceptual space, that's huge, man. You've gotta come on my pod again, Mike, and talk about this specifically, the epistemological divide. I'm being serious. Like, I can't do it next week, but like the weekend after, like that, like legit. That that's
just
something
let me
that
know.
wants more attention. And yeah, I mean that encompasses kind of like the entire political ontology of the 21st century, and like even people are kind of like hip to those things. You know, like how, you know, kind of like the internet has changed discourse. They don't like attack it like that. I mean, you're always a dope like guest to have on the pod, but that specifically warrants attention. I got to raise up in a minute, man, because I got an appointment in about half an hour, and I gotta get myself together. This was this was great though, man. Thanks again so much for hosting me, and never hesitate to reach out, man. Like I said, I'm busy with stuff, but you guys especially, you know, I'm happy to give you priority, but I'm always down to like freaking record, man, especially on like a Saturday morning or whatever. So don't hesitate to reach out, man. Going forward.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, it's been great having you. Steelstorm II, it was a pleasure to go through it and do the actual editing and like rereading, because I sat down and actually like I just plowed through both Steelstorms. I got through one last night and then two over the course of today. And it's funny because now reading these with some distance, I really enjoyed it. Like, even more than I did when I was like editing it, because when you're into the nitty gritty of it, it's a little bit of a different beast and everything like that. But it was like,
no,
you know,
course.
It was really a pleasure to read through and everything like that. I actually had some excerpts that I wanted to read a little bit of, because I think it does. There's some things that you do very right as a prose stylist, but you know, we can continue and talk a little bit after you go, but thank you very much for coming on the pod. It's been awesome having you.
No, man, that's a huge compliment. And yeah, you really had to suffer through some bureaucratic and nonsense and some political antagonism to like get both of these published. So I really appreciate that, man. But yeah,
That's a whole other story.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I'm sorry to raise up abruptly, but but yeah, I'll be in touch on T-Grant, man, later today, and we can figure out when is best for you to record. And thank you, Dave. I really appreciate you hosting me, and yeah, you too. Like, don't hesitate to reach out, man. Ever, like, because I'm always happy to record, man. Like, don't ever think that, you know, you're screwing with my program by asking me to.
Our pleasure, Mr. T. Thank you so much for coming on.
All right, fellas.
All right, T777. What a smart guy. I like him.
Oh yeah, absolutely, man. He's a real feather in our cap in the scene. He's he really is probably in the top 1% of guys that actually know something about third position stuff, and I'm talking about guys at the university level as well. He really is kind of our Noam Chomsky in that particular domain. Like, he's just absolutely a very legendary figure in that stuff. But yeah, in terms of sci-fi, so another thing that I did for prepping for this episode is that I read a couple of Dave's stories, and I thought this was really interesting because they were both set in the same world, but they weren't connected. And this is something that like I really like that, actually. This was a little bit refreshing because, you know, a lot of times, you know, as we were talking about before, you go through and, you know, if you're reading, I have not read any new sci-fi apart from your stuff and Thomas's, really. In like, I guess the newest thing probably that I've read is like, you know, some of Neuromancer and everything. So we're talking old shit, right?
Yeah.
Like almost 40 years old kind of thing or whatever. So I don't really know what's going on currently in the scene apart from, you know, what I read about, but I don't think that you probably would get a lot of this. A lot of times you'd probably get like, you know, what we're talking about, like these 900-page tomes of, you know, quadrilogies that like span just like, you know, 1 million words or something ridiculous. That just doesn't even earn like my attention for like 5,000 words, much less that length of time. And I think a lot of them are, you know, they're serialized. They're in the same world. It's like one epically long, enormously long story. But what I kind of liked about these stories, apart from some of the other stuff that we'll talk about here, is that they're not really connected. They're connected by the caste system that these characters, you know, are part of or not part of. They're connected by some of the politics that are kind of like going on in the world and everything like that, but they're not connected narratively. And I thought that was really cool. So did you want to say a little bit about like what these stories were about, maybe for the audience?
Yeah. Well, first I would like to say, I wanted to bring this up to Thomas, but he had to bounce out. As we're talking about kind of like these libtoads and what they do, you know, what they did in that they're doing in the academy, and this is exactly what they did in science fiction and fantasy too, is once they got into the seats of power into the institutions, they infected the institutions, they took it and they, regardless of how well it did financially or culturally or whatever, which they ruined it, right? They collapsed it. They pretty much just like took their sweaty, pink, bulbous bodies and slithered into their coves where they just like slop about in their slime with stink and stench and just rub themselves profusely and jerk each other off. And they just like, I got a little weird.
That was a very vivid picture.
they pretty much just like all jerk each other off in this like weird space, and they kind of take it away, and people are like, oh, where'd it go? And it's like completely gone. And what they create in this slimy stink hole where they exist now is so vulgar and fatty and grotesque that what happens is on the outside, guys that are either in our sphere or adjacent react to it and do the opposite. So they're so grossed out by the weird, like nasty, perverted stuff that they do, that they create this like, this is my criticism. This might trigger a couple people, but this is, you know, I'm just speaking truth, right? Is they create this like very like dry toast, like vanilla kind of stuff where there is no brutality, there is no sex, there's no vulgarity, there's like nothing gritty or grim about it. They create this like 1980s era Superman, like everything truth and justice, everything good, and it's to me that's not interesting. So when I create stuff, I'm not scared. When I write my sword and sorcery, my characters, they pipe hose with big titties. They slaughter monsters and rip their guts out of their bodies. There's like, it's brutality. There's weird. I take the grim and the grotesque and the body horror and like all this stuff, and I crank it up and put it all together into this like, you know, whereas these guys, they very much view themselves as they're wielding the Excalibur to slay the demons. I'm pretty much taking a baseball bat with rusty nails sticking out of it, and I want to bludgeon them to death with it. And this is kind of like my approach to storytelling. Not always. I write stuff that's not as grim and brutal, but I like it. I think it's a very appropriate thing. So in these stories that you're talking about, they're sci-fi stories, but they're not like what you would describe, and they're in a setting that I just call Dome. Right. And I have other stories that are done that are be coming out with it too. And pretty much the story of this realm is it's on Earth. there was like a gigantic catastrophe. It was a nuclear winter. Everything, the ecology of the world collapsed. The humanity developed this gene editing process to get the last living remnants of the planet to accelerate their habituation, their genetic divergence, in order to habituate to the planet's environment. Well, in this, they created a bunch of monsters. Like everything turned into monsters. The place is full of this weird stuff. The nuclear fallout, the half-life is going to be there for like 1 million years. And regular humans can't live there. So what they did is they created domes. And these domes are these like gigantic energy fields where within them they build these ridiculous, monstrous metropolises, right? And they can't build sideways because the dome can only go, so they just build up and up and up and up, and they build on top of buildings on top of buildings on top of buildings. I think in that story I kind of describe it as it's more like a fungus colony than a place where people live. And you have this caste system of people at the top who are these genetically engineered supermen. Effectively, they're tall and beautiful and super high intellect, and they're all descended from this one guy named the Drighton and his family line. And they kind of oversee all of the organization in society and keep it all together. Now, the problem in this world is that there's also a rogue artificial intelligence thing called Ascension. And Ascension it like really wants to just wipe out humanity and replace them with what are called asapiens, which are these like genetically assembled humanoids that they just drop, and they're super subversive. So if they use any sort of Wi-Fi or radio or anything that's not closed wired, Ascension will triangulate their position and infiltrate their civilization and completely destroy it. So there's looming threat of that. There's these mutated humanoids walking around called mongrel men. They're every animal is completely mutated and screwed up and irradiated. You can't just go out into the planet. You have to wear suits outside of the dome. In the dome, there's this entire caste system where the people at the top run everything, and they got to try to do their best and everything like that. They have to fight all the monsters and keep it safe, but they also have to manage these people who over the last 50,000 years have devolved to live in these corridors underneath what's called the partition, and they they're underborn and stuff. It's just there's a lot going on with it. But you're right. I don't write this linear story. I write individual stories. Every time you read a story in Dome, it's going to be different characters, and it's pretty much some of it is. I didn't intend it, but some of it became a little bit of a metaphor. I'm sorry, I'm yakking and yakking and yakking. Tell me what you thought about the two stories.
Right. Okay. So they were both great. I think I liked the second one a little bit better. I could actually see a little bit of development in your prose style. I think it was a little bit longer, and there was some interesting lore that was going on in the story that I thought was really cool. And you touched on it there at the very end. The second one, called She Has Arrived, from Bizarchives 4. The first one, what was the name of it? It was from Bizarchives 1.
They Never Woke Up.
That's right. Yeah, that's what it was. They were both really cool in very similar ways, but the lore that I thought was awesome that sticks out in my mind. And this is something that, a lot of times guys think that, to write a great story, it needs to have this overarching narrative that is just that fits together, kind of like this very, very detailed tapestry, and it needs to weave together like Tolkien in a very harmonious way, and it needs to be this big thing and everything. A lot of times what I remember about writing is I remember one passage, or I remember one little thing that happens in the story, and it just sticks in my mind forever. And there was one of these things in She Has Arrived that I thought was really cool, like that, where as you mentioned, they have these lowborn characters that are kind of they're not mutants or whatever, but they're just sort of genetically deteriorated over time. They're the lowest caste. They're like the outcasts in some ways. And they live in these gigantic slums, almost like a Kowloon city kind of thing, where it's like rats crawling around in this like dense network of like sewers that get smaller and smaller and darker as you go deeper into them. And these things are, kept lighted by like batteries, or by battery power, or by like being connected to the grid or something like that. But occasionally what will happen is in some of these slums, these low-born slums, is that they won't, like, something will happen with the power grid or whatever, and they will go black. And when they go black, that's it for them. Basically, they live in darkness forever, and obviously they perish because they don't have any electricity and no food or anything like that. They're finished, right? And I just like the passage where you explain that, and there was something kind of like came back at the very end about that, was like one of these little things that kind of sticks in my mind. It's just like it's just a thing that like it just stays with you, right? And there was like a piece of writing advice that I basically gave on Twitter that I think kind of like it's similar. It's similar in some ways. Like you don't have to. World building is a lot less important than having good prose. If you have like a really detailed, like built up world and shit prose, no one cares. But if you have like basically no world building and it's just like guys walking around like being based and like just like like you said, piping hose and like slaughtering like degenerates, it's like that is everyone's going to love that, and it'll have foreverness kind of thing, right? So prose matters more than world building, and having some of these crazy sort of like things that just like stick out at you is as good as having like 8 out of 10 prose over 900 pages. If you just have one of these things that kind of sticks out. And this is sort of an example. We're getting away from sci-fi here. There's this book that by Gore Vidal, not the kind of thing I would normally read, but I don't know, somebody recommended it to me. There was some reason why I read this book called Kalki. And what it was basically, so this is going to be a spoiler alert for this book Kalki. Basically what happened was, this small group of scientists and people engineered a like world destroying virus because they wanted to kill off 99.99998% of humanity or whatever, but something kind of went wrong where it did its job too well. It killed off too many people. There was this like one tiny little pocket of people left at the end of the world. And they were just like, it was basically trying to figure out how to like have humanity continue on, because it was like only so many women. And there was a doctor, the doctor in this group that basically had like selected the people who were going to survive in this pocket based on like genetic compatibility, where there was only like so many people who would be able to breed with these women because for various reasons, like, some of the men were just like genetically incompatible, couldn't produce like viable offspring with these women. But it turned out that the scientist himself had actually selected all men that were incompatible, could not produce, viable offspring except for himself. So this was his way of being like, okay, well, I'm going to be the new Adam at the beginning of the next cycle of the world or whatever. And like basically the leader of the group was like, nah, fuck that. And he shot the guy. So it's like just instantly dooms humanity to extinction. Right. And that scene, that like the thing that I described probably fairly poorly, has always stuck out at me. I was like, when I read this at the end of the book, I was just like fucking crushed. I was like depressed for a week after I read this book, but it has always stayed with me. And I don't even remember almost anything else about the book. It could have had the shittiest, like, whatever, like the whole thing could have been basically a dud. As long as I got that far and I read that, and it was like, it's always just stuck out with me. So anyway, I kind of got vibes of that with this like things going black kind of thing in yours. So I thought that was really cool. I got more to say about it, but yeah, I'll just sort of see how that hits you for now.
Yeah, that's I completely agree. I literally, I don't want to say I don't care at all about world building. I just like I care very little about it. I have the world built in my head, and like I just want to tell the reader a story. I just want to tell you a story about this thing, and this is how I am with like all of my short stories. Is read my stories, and because I come from the school of Howard and Lovecraft, they do the same thing. They don't dump lore on you. It doesn't start with this big exposition in the beginning. It's a whole first chapter telling you about the world and the time period. They just, here's a character, here's their adventure or their tragedy or whatever they're involved in, and you have to piece the world together as it goes along. And that, in my opinion, is the way to tell fiction. There's only
absolutely.
one Tolkien, there's only one Herbert. You don't need to do that. Just tell a cool story. And that passage that you're talking about, specifically the going black thing, that I put that in there because I was like, I want the reader to realize like this. It's not even about teaching the reader about the lore. It's about like really forcing upon them the idea that this is a grim existence, that these people live like in this place. They live not underground, but under all of these like layers of steel and everything. And they're in this maze of corridors, and their light, just something very simple. When their light goes out, they can't find their way out. You know what I mean? They're done. Yeah. You know what I mean? And nobody knows what they do with themselves. They lay down and die. They kill themselves. They try to survive. Nobody knows, because it's like, that's what it is.
Well, it's a perfect example of the like writing advice, show, don't tell, right? Like you could have said in the most flowery language that these people live a grim existence, but instead of doing that, you showed how they did it by giving a concrete example, right? Like there's a famous passage by, what is his name? Chekhov, or it's not passage, it's like his writing advice where he says something like, don't tell me that the moon is out. Show me the glinting moonlight on the shattered glass on the ground, or something like that. You know what I mean? That's show, don't tell kind of thing. And that's what you did very well with that. And I think another interesting thing, like if you did, write more in this like Dome series, I think that would be, it would be innovative for today, right? Because it's not something that you really see. If you just had like 10 or 20 stories of like 1,000 words each or something like that, that was just like unconnected stories within the same world, that would be kind of refreshing, actually. I would love to read that. I don't know that I would necessarily have, because of the fact that I'm a publisher, I don't have that much time to read anything except for what we publish. That's something that I could sit down and I could take like, bite-sized chunks. I could like read one a week or something without like losing the thread of the plot because I've read so much else. That would be pretty cool. I like that idea. And I think this is the kind of thing that like guys like us could get into, because to be honest, I think, for the most part, people who are sort of, in the radical right or that are nationalists or whatever probably have, busy lives, and, they don't really have all that much time to sit down and read like these like thick tomes, even though that's some of what we do sell in Imperium Press. I think that a lot of guys are like, the shit that sells very well is stuff like Steelstorm or The Populist Delusion or whatever. These like bite-sized, like, 150 page or 100 page books and things like that. That's what people have time for. And, that I think that would be really cool if you put something out like that with your Dome series. Now, another thing that you do very well, and Thomas does very well also, is you write really good fight scenes. There was an awesome fucking fight scene in the second one. And actually, I pulled an excerpt because I want to read this out, because guys who are listening here, this is how you do it. Okay. So I'm just going to read this out. Before the Carl could finish negotiating, the lowborn rush him. One charges straight for his torso with his blade outstretched. The other leaps through the air, both hands on the makeshift pommel, attempting to plunge it downward into Bjorn's throat. With unnatural quickness, the Carl sidesteps the initial charge, redirecting the lowborn's momentum and grabbing him from behind. A look of horror freezes on the leaping man's face as he accidentally plunges his blade into his comrade's throat, which the Carl has placed in his knife's trajectory. The man gargles as blood sprays out of his esophagus, splattering his friend's face and blinding him. With a swift forward kick to the chest, the Carl sends the blood-painted lowborn tumbling backwards. His knife goes skipping across the concrete. He watches on in horror as the Carl grapples his opponent's blade away from him and gruesomely slashes the man's open throat across his entire neck. Bjorn grips his chin upward, and blood quickly drains from his neck before he tosses his twitching corpse to the ground. That's fucking bass, dude.
Right.
There's so much. There's a lot in there. There's a lot of interesting stuff in there. First of all, I kind of read it in such a way that this would come across. There's a pace to it. There's a quickness. There's a rapidity to the prose that really, like, it just, like, when you read this passage, your heart rate goes up a couple of beats per minute. You know what I mean? It's very exciting the way it's written. And I think part of that is that there is some interesting alliteration that actually goes into it. Just on a technical level, there's a few things, tosses his twitching corpse and things like that. That probably wasn't even planned, but just sort of comes out as like a good musician might have, like something that sounds improvised but isn't, or whatever, or that sounds like it's meant to be that way but it's improvised. That's the kind of thing that you get from it. And yeah, there's definitely a speed to this passage that I think is really great. Obviously, it's violent. There's a lot of things kind of happening at once. I don't know. It's hard to explain what this passage gets right. I think just reading it is probably self-evident for that. But yeah, and I thought that was really good. It was really cool to see that fight scene.
Yeah, that's you mentioned I do consciously put in alliteration. It's actually a struggle that I have with a couple of my editors, because they have degrees and they went to school and they don't quite they're very modern, right? Not modern as like postmodern. They come from the school of Ernest Hemingway and stuff like that. So they kind of, I don't want to beat them up too much because they're great and I love them and we work together really, really well. But it's a little bit of a struggle because they're like, well, this takes away from the story. You should just use what the basic words necessary. And I'm like, no, the meter and the cadence and like all that kind of stuff, to the alliteration, like the way that it sounds, you put a poetic quality to the prose and it adds to it, in my opinion. Right. So, I do that on purpose. Yeah.
No, that's great. And it comes out that way because there is a rhythmic quality to it. There is a poetic quality to it. There's a rhythm. There's a pace. There's a speed to it that I think is really, really good. And what I noticed was interesting is that Thomas does the same sort of thing, actually. His prose is a little bit different. His word choices are a little bit, and I think none of this is conscious on either of your parts. His word choices are a little bit more Latinate. They tend to use somewhat longer words and definitely more Latin derived words. This tends to make it sound more technical, which is, I think, what he's going for with Steelstorm. Steelstorm has an interesting kind of coldness to it in a way that I think is really cool, and I could expand on that perhaps. I'll read one of his passages here. So I should have done this for yours. I'll set the scene. So this is where his cyborg Zartax that he described early in the podcast is like, it's first basically coming into consciousness. They're basically booting it up for the first time and gonna see what it does, kind of thing, when it first wakes up, because the thing is basically set where it's almost like a drug addict. It needs to get these beta endorphins, which you can only get like from within the brain stem of its victims or whatever. So anyway, it wakes up and it starts to immediately, it's like a junkie looking for a fix kind of thing. Oh, yeah. So here's the passage. Husseini was still speaking when he noticed that Zartax had leapt the 15 feet between himself and young Theron. having run target acquisition and lethal assault protocol in 1,000th of a second. In a moment, the killer machine had broken the youth's neck and deployed a secondary weapon system incorporated into his prosthetic right arm. Utilizing a 14-inch bayonet with laser-augmented single cutting edge, it cut into the dead man's skull, intent on reaching the brain matter to harvest the pulverized pituitary gland for beta endorphins, bound for the medicinal dosage chamber just below where the robot's left ear had been prior to catastrophic injury and subsequent bodily prosthesis.
Yeah, that's completely different than how I write action scenes.
It's very different, but it's got the same speed. It's got the same, like, you know, in 1,000th of a second, this happens. In a moment, the machine had broken the guy's neck and so on and so forth. A lot of, like, X is happening as Y is happening. A lot of things are happening simultaneously. It's like the whole scene, you know, how long did that take me to describe? I don't know, 20 seconds or something like that. But but what occurs in that scene probably takes like 1.5 seconds. You know what I mean? So it's like there's a speed to it that's like really, it comes across that way. But again, the word choices are very different. Yours are very Germanic. I think if I was to run an analysis on these two different passages, you would see far more Germanic word choices in yours and far more Latinate ones in his. That's just a difference in prose style. But it's some of his, like, some of Thomas's like fight scenes or, like, you know, violent exchanges that happen in these things are just, they're very Homeric in a lot of the violence. And this is something that I use for the blurb on the back cover of both of the Steelstorms. But I think it's really true. Like, if you read Homer, like, it seems like a third of the book is just like eyes getting gouged out, like spears crushing through guys' teeth and coming out the back of the skull and things like that. It's very graphic. It's extremely graphic. So Homer is kind of like, in some sense, like a combination between like the Metro opera and the Bible and like the WWE of his era. It's like a combination of all those things. And there's so much fucking violence, and it's so gruesome and grotesque, and I definitely don't want to say vulgar, but it's extremely sort of like gritty kind of thing. You know what I mean? And you get a lot of that in Thomas's stuff too. He's very, very detailed about like the viscera that are sort of like coming out of the guy's guts as he you know, gets blown away by like a depth charge or some crazy shit like that. There's a lot of that stuff in Thomas's writing. Now, the violence is much, much more punctuated than Homer. There's not a lot of it, but when you get it, it's really descriptive and everything like that. And his prose style really kind of matches up with that, with the technical sounding terminology and everything like that. So yeah, no, both you guys are really good at writing fight scenes. That's what I'm sort of getting at here.
Yeah, he's more of a, I don't know if this is the right word for it, but he's more of a like a narrative kind of guy where he's like describing like the results of everything and this and that. Whereas I'm a very literal writer. Like I'll tell you, like, this guy steps here and this goes by his head and blah 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 blah. Like, I give like the details like it's an action movie or something. So yeah, which both are good. Like, both are fine. They're very violent. And one thing that I noticed, he also writes in present tense, and that I write things that I write that are pretty much everything that I write is in present tense for the most part. Anything that's, you know what,
I was going to mention that too. Actually, this is something I don't know. I'm not. This is not a criticism, but I found it a little distracting because I'm just not used to it. A lot of times, you know, I'd be like reading through your prose, and it's like everything's humming along, and then something catches my ear, so to speak, where I'm like, oh shit, yeah, it's in present tense. But that, it's just, I'm not used to it, right? Like, I read a lot of the fiction that I read, or basically all the fiction that I read, is in past tense. So it's just something different. That's not a criticism. It's just like, and I think that maybe, and I'm not sure about this, but perhaps the present tense, choice of tense that you had was maybe part of the immediacy and the speed of your your fight scene or whatever. It might lend itself better to that. I'd have to really think about it, but it just sort of occurs to me on the fly. That might be part of it too.
Yeah. It was done traditionally in more like classic stuff, but present tense is not really that since like it's something that's very pulpy, right? If you go back, you read a lot of the pulps, a lot of these are in present tense, right? It's something that got taken away when they start making like creative writing rules, and they're like, you have to, there's like rules about the narrative and stuff. I never went to college, you know what I mean? I barely graduated high school, so I don't have those rules in my head. So I just make what I think is going to sound cool. And when I write a story that I think is going to have action, I want there to be. I do write in past tense. Like I submitted a story. It's in Aegon issue 3. It's called Parables of the Biomancer, and it's effectively like this manifesto of a mad scientist. It's another. I probably should have sent you that too, but yeah, that's in past tense, right? And so that's it's just something that I do. So as far as but you didn't give me your take on like the entire narrative, because you mentioned you read the 2 stories. The first one, They Never Woke Up, is like 1,100 words. I literally wrote that story just so I could have that twist ending. That was I just wanted to make that twist ending and everything like that, which people really liked. You know, I thought that came out pretty well. But the second story is a much longer, more developed story. So I want to hear your take on what the overall narrative is and what you got from it.
Yeah. So, to be honest, the first story has sort of faded from my memory a little bit in terms of the actual narrative and everything. But it has sort of like twist ending at the end. And for me, it actually kind of establishes the world pretty nicely, right? Because I actually originally when it started out, I sort of like was picturing something that was happening maybe on like a spacecraft or something like that. But then, of course, all of the sort of like background with like the dome and the fact that they're sort of like moving between these domes and everything like that, it sort of like comes into focus or whatever. Definitely the second one I thought was that one stood out a little bit more to me, and it's very interesting. There's some sort of like ancient themes, maybe that's a way to put it. There's some sort of like mythic themes throughout both yours and Thomas's. So the story of the second one, She Has Arrived, if I could sort of like try and summarize it in what's probably going to be a fairly clunky way, is that there is this Carl named Bjorn who I forget exactly what the sort of like driving engine of the story is or whatever, but he basically his motivation is really to produce an heir, and he eventually he comes across, like, he goes into this like lowborn slum, right? Like, as we discussed with like the Going Dark and everything like that. And he, like, I mean, this is a guy who's like lived through like centuries and centuries for like, he's been, some technical means has like allowed him to like extend his life, but it still has no heirs. And he basically plucks this like lowborn woman out of obscurity and turns her into his bride. But it's very interesting because she is not really meant, because he's a Carl, so he's a nobleman. He lives a very different life than these people, and she's not really meant to live that life. She's not really happy with that life. She really sort of goes with him because I guess she feels like she doesn't have a choice. And you could tell over the course of the story that she's really kind of starting to, like, her spirit is kind of starting to die. She's starting to fade, kind of like as a person, not eating that much when, he gives her these sumptuous dinners and everything, and not really speaking that much over time and everything. And he has to basically do some sort of like medical intervention, some like very advanced, like, technical, like medical intervention to be able to actually inseminate or to impregnate her. But finally he does. Finally they conceive a child, but the child is born and it's just this monstrous thing. And there was something interesting about this. I don't know if this was intended, but the fact that it was born with no bones actually kind of reminded me a little bit of the what is it? It's the Volsunga saga, I think, with Ivor the Boneless or something like that. I don't know if that was in your head or anything where you were writing that, but that was like, that definitely came to mind when I heard that, especially because there's other Germanic elements in it with like the castes and things like that. Anyway, so this monstrous like daughter is born to him or whatever, and I guess I should probably like not give away everything, including like the crazy ending and stuff like that. But that's like,
it's been out for 6 months. Like, you can go ahead. It's been out.
All right. So yeah, he basically just like snaps and like has like a mental breakdown of some kind, and I forget exactly how that goes on, but he has this mental breakdown, and then he just basically like leaps from the top of a building with this like monster baby and just like splats onto the pavement with the both of them. And there's like there's almost kind of like a sort of like touching little thing that he says at the end where he's like, monsters don't go to heaven, so I won't see you in the afterlife. And what he's talking about though is himself as the monster, because doing what he's about to do kind of thing. So I thought that was a great story, man. Like, I thought that one was really good. The first one didn't make nearly as much of an impression, although I thought it was good. The second one, I was like, that's fucking banging. It was really good. I would recommend that. I think anyone listening to this should pick up Bizarre Archives 4 and read it, because it was great. And I'm sure there's lots of other. I haven't actually. I got Bizarre Archives 4. I've only read this one story from it. I'm sure there's lots of other great stuff in there too.
Yeah, it's she has arrived. I kind of like. Here's the thing: when I go start a story, I can conceptualize it in my head, and I don't really think of what I'm trying to convey. And what I'm trying to convey is actually like kind of post hoc. I know that sounds weird, but I write the story and then I'm like, oh yeah, I was trying to convey this. You know what I mean? Does that make sense? I don't know. It sounds kind of weird.
A lot of times these things are below the threshold of consciousness. A lot of times you don't know what you're trying to convey, but you are trying subconsciously, and it, like, you just recognize it after the fact. It makes total sense.
Yeah, pretty much the story is about you got this highborn guy. He's a nobleman. He's but the problem with the noble people, the noble caste, is that over years of their genetic engineering and their rejuvenation treatments, which extends their life, it has damaged their fertility. So they're like dwindling in numbers over time, and they're just like an aging population, right? It sounds familiar. So yeah. he goes, he's like starting to like, lose his shit, and he like becomes all broke. He goes, these lowborn try to rob him. Because he's so much bigger and stronger and faster and has military training, he just completely slaughters them. And then he feels horrible about it, because he's like, these guys are probably fathers. Who the fuck am I to kill these dads? And blah, blah, blah. And then he goes, he sad sacks and starts going delusional. And he meets this girl that he believes looks like his first wife that he like never got over. Her name was Tila, right? And she's these people that live on the below the partition are like very low IQ. They're short. They're weird looking. They're like sort of mutants. They're deteriorated genetics mutants. So he's like, he has this thing. He like falls in love with her instantly. Writes the mom a blank check. And for people that like wear rags and live in hovels and eat rats, a blank check from this guy is like, we're all liberated. You know what I mean? Yeah. So, he takes her back. She doesn't understand the world. She's not smart enough to comprehend it. He treats her like a China doll. He doesn't even see that she's miserable, and it effectively keeps her in his house. And like I imply this, but he kind of like rapes her. You know what I mean? Like, she's not into this at all, and he's like trying to impregnate her. And he sits her up like a China doll and pampers her, and she just doesn't like it. So he goes and gets this street gobbledygook from the underground, from So whatever, and shoots her up with this green ooze. She gets impregnated with this monster. The monster is born, and she snaps, and she's like, "You put a monster in me!" And he's like, how dare you? He shoots her in the head, shoots everybody.
That's what it was. Yeah. That was the breaking point. Now I remember. Yeah.
Yeah. So he just goes fucking bonker. Yeah. There's more to it than that, but it's at the end of the day, it's about an aging population trying to replenish their genetics by using foreigners or different people. It's about the use of technology and the effects that they have on our mind and our being. And it's at the end of the day, it's about the very no matter how far in the future we go and how much technology and everything that we utilize, the very basic foundations of the human experience and the rites of passage will never be able to escape that, like being a father. At the end of the day, this is about a dude that could never become a father, and it fucks him up.
Well, as I could imagine, as it would for anybody. No, that's interesting. I actually kind of read it as more of an individual kind of not really the degradation or like death of a whole caste or race or anything like that, but more like this guy's quest to become a father and have a lineage and have descendants and everything like that.
That's it. That's the main story.
Yeah, that's basically sort of the thrust of it and everything. And so I found that very sympathetic and it was quite interesting and everything. But yeah, there's definitely a quality to it where it's a bit of a warning, right? You may not have intended it this way, but it's a bit of a warning against becoming that caste of like aging nobles that is just not able to replenish itself and sort of like loses touch with the sort of brute animal, like fecundity that like comes with not being noble, like being close to nature, being something sort of more barbarian, although nobility and barbarism are not incompatible, I don't think. But anyway, there's a warning there. There's definitely something where, even though this, it's not saying that like, we in our world are necessarily going to be in that position in the near future, because it's obviously in the far future, but there is a kind of state of affairs that could come to pass. And I think that this is one of the important parts of sci-fi and what makes it mythic. This is something that I wanted to talk about with when Thomas was here, because he and I have talked about this before. I'd like to introduce our audience to the idea of the Cerealian myth. Basically, this is what I think makes sci-fi especially mythic and what makes it really vital and interesting and important for us as a people. Is a very, very mythic genre, where in the Cerealian type myth, we're not talking about like, reading Homer or reading the Eddas or anything like that. For him, what the myth is, he says, the myths are not descriptions of things, but expressions of a determination to act. That's kind of what the Cerealian myth is in a nutshell. What he means by that, not a description of things, but expressions of a determination to act. A myth, yes, it does describe things. It paints a picture of a state of affairs, but it's a state of affairs in the foreseeable future, and it has a kind of moral to it. It has normative content. It's a state of affairs either that is to be achieved or to be avoided, right? And sci-fi has this eschatological quality to it, where it's sort of like pointing to something that's about to happen, or like the will of God is about to be revealed, or something is about to come to pass, and it's either good or bad, and you're either supposed to avoid or lean into it. And this is why Star Trek is, I hate to keep hacking on it, but I just fucking hate Star Trek, is that it lacks any of these qualities at all. It doesn't say, like, there's no mythic quality to it in any way. And especially because it's not, techno-skeptical in any way. It's just a bunch of stuff that's like basically what we do right now, but like, with better technology and all the same. It's just like basically painting a picture of the world as it is today, but with more better tech and like, you know, slightly more progressive and everything's hunky dory and all these, you know, shitty, boring ass like stories get wrapped up within, you know, 22 minutes or whatever, 44 minutes or whatever it is. That's not the way sci-fi is supposed to work. Sci-fi is supposed to give you a state of affairs, and it's supposed to be something that you're either heading towards, and that you're either supposed to avoid it or steer towards it, kind of thing. The myth is essentially, for Sorel, kind of command that's actually couched in propositional language. It's like an ought or not that's couched in the language of is. It's a story, but really it's a command telling you to either do this or avoid this. And this is what the best sci-fi does. Again, you know, the examples I gave earlier, H.G. Wells' Time Machine, Arthur C. Clarke's 2001. You could talk about, you know, we've mentioned this one a few times, Neuromancer, Snow Crash. All these like classic sci-fi stories have a bit of a warning to them, right? And this is what the Sorelian myth is kind of all about. And so I think that sci-fi is an extremely, extremely mythic genre, and that especially the second story that you wrote really does actually have that. And that's part of why it's successful, and it's part of why I remembered it. You know what I mean? That's why it stuck out to me as a story.
Yeah, I did a whole show. People would go watch one of my episodes of The Bog. I argue that mythopoetic qualities of science fiction. You know, it's I think I mentioned earlier, I think it's part of our epoch. And like you said, like I don't hate Star Trek, but I hate the premise. I enjoyed watching some of it when I was younger, but now that I'm older, I can't even watch it. It's just like, so, you know, for me, sci-fi is almost a subgenre of horror. I think that, you know, when I think of the great sci-fi, you know, War of the Worlds is a spooky story, right?
It is,
you go read these old sci-fi pulps. They're about like people's minds melting together and like weird experiments and mad science and the end of the world and doom and aliens, and like aliens aren't like E.T., like they're your friend, you know, whatever. They're these like bizarre, they're almost Lovecraftian, you know what I mean? But these just bizarre creatures. And I think that a lot of the reactionary sci-fi, and I said this before, when it's not completely overtly political, it's too squeaky clean for me. I try to implement like things like body horror and like gross. I like put in the gross out and the bizarre, because I want to show the reader, like not like tell you like, oh well, this bad thing might happen. I want to viscerally show you the absolute monstrous outcomes that could possibly happen. Can I read one more excerpt from my story this is like my favorite one that I wrote. So
go for it.
This is like towards the crescendo of the story, and I wanted to show people like when you monkey with something that's sacred and natural, like reproduction, human reproduction and mating rituals and giving birth in itself, for you guys out there that are dads, know that it's not a pretty thing. It's pretty fucking gross. It stinks. It's nasty, but in it, it's beautiful, right? It's beautiful. And if something like that got monkeyed with, like we put our fingers into how this process happens, what could come out is like horrors beyond our comprehension. And I'm going to read this real quick. And this is what I put it. I'm going to read two quick paragraphs here. And this starts with Carl Bjorn. I'll just read the birth here. So it goes, Carl Bjorn rushes his girl there, and she gives birth to this monster. Jackie shrieks in excruciating pain as her body contracts and bloats. Her stomach is pressed upon from within by wild thrashing shapes. The doctors and nurses gag and recoil at the stench emitted by the yellowish slop oozing from her womb. Bjorn cheers it on with celebratory tears in his eyes, unfazed by the grotesque display before him. With a blood-curdling scream, she howls and pushes. From her body comes a wet crunching sound that, as what infests her insides, is vomited into a cold steel tray. The doctors look on in horror at the mockery of nature before them. In a swamp of curdled pus and steaming, blood-streaked yellow discharge lies a squirming grotesquerie. Short, boneless legs fused together like an ophidian appendage, its torso hairless and shriveled, with a ribless chest revealing its pulsating insides with each groaning breath. An oblong eyeless skull crowded with hooked fangs emerging from bloodied black gums. She's beautiful, Bjorn lifts the writhing creature from the pan, his eyes streaming with tears of happiness. His lips meet the child's soft skull for a kiss. Strings of yellow slime peel away and dangle from his mouth. The hideous infant gurgles and growls as it flounders in his loving embrace.
It's like, it's so over the top. It's like, it's so gross. It's funny. You know what I mean? I love it. No, it's fucking awesome, man.
I crank things up to their absurdity. It's okay to laugh at it, but it is also like disturbing. But but it's like to entertain. You know what I mean? That's like my main thing is I want to entertain the reader and not just fucking bore them with this like lore dump of world building. And I don't want you to read a textbook. I want you to experience something that's fucking weird.
Yeah. What was that? The like wet like snap or like something like that. There was just like some like visceral description there.
Wet
like,
crunching sound.
Yeah, that's it. It's just so perfect, right? Because it's not normal. It's something out of the ordinary kind of thing, like the wet crunching sound. I always remember this passage in Cormac McCarthy's Blood Meridian, which is one of my favorites, where he talks about like the dull snap of the guy's leg that's just getting severed, and I'm like, it's just he can hear it. You know what I mean? Yeah, like the wet crunching sound is another one of those. Oh, no, that's perfect, man. That's awesome. No, definitely. This is writing should be fun. Writing should be interesting, and it should be a trip. It should be like there should be something weird about it. And this is sort of like goes to a broader point of like anything that is truly like legendary is unclassifiable and weird. Like, like Chaucer's Canterbury Tales is kind of its own genre. You know what I mean? It's not, and that's like it almost like creates a genre sort of thing. Something like Moby Dick. So a perfect example is Tolkien, who did create his own genre. It's totally unclassifiable, and this is what makes something legendary. So don't be afraid to try something. Don't be afraid to do something that's so grotesque it's hilarious. You know what I mean? Like, this is great. I love it. This theodinic in me. I like shit that pushes boundaries. I like shit that like is challenges things, that crosses genres or steps out of the normal the normal categories of our experience kind of thing. So this is really cool.
I think that there's like a beauty to that, to cranking the weirdness up. You know what I mean? Because while I'm like, for me, when I'm writing that, or a certain writer, another writer that's in the Bizarre Archives, my boy Shane Hawks with his story, The Molybdus Articulate, he goes nuts with this. Like his descriptions are just absolutely bizarre and kind of terrible. It's like nightmare fuel. It's so weird. But when you read it, it's some people read it and they like laugh at it. And it's not laughing like it's actually a comedy or whatever. They're laughing because it's just entertaining. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And I think that there's like when you crank up the weird, when you employ things like high weirdness in your art, it thrusts upon the reader an entertainment quality, an entertaining quality, an immersion quality that they don't get from shit anymore. Everything is just like boring or rehashed or put all of the politics aside, put everything aside. Modern entertainment is just fucking stale. It sucks.
You know? Yeah. I don't want to get like too deep into old here, but I can't watch Netflix. I mean, it's just I find it so fucking dull. I can't really get into any of these like series. I can't get into. Maybe it's just because I am just a cantankerous old fart now or something. I don't know.
Yeah, that's what this whole show's about, bud.
Yeah, well, exactly. we are the culture dads, but this is like I just can't fucking. It's just boring as fuck. I don't know. Like, it's just like the missus wants to watch something on Netflix, and I'm like, okay, or whatever, right? Oh, it's just boring. I like actually, this is not totally true. There's some stuff. There was this one, was it a series? I don't know what the fuck it was. It's called The House on Haunted Hill. That one kept me up at night, actually. So that was very well done. If I thought really hard about it, I could probably come up with a handful of others, but it just seems like there's not much of it. There's a lot of stuff out there, and a lot of it is very mediocre. Almost none of it pushes any boundaries or tries to do anything different. And this is what makes art great. So, it's kudos to you for doing that. I've seen some of it in the other Bizarre Archives as well. Thomas is doing something different in this way. Like if you read Steelstorm, it does not. He's got his own prose style. It doesn't sound like anybody else, and especially we didn't even get into talking about this. The totally fractured narrative, the non-linearity of the narrative. He's not the only one to have non-linear narrative. But imagine that you took Quentin Tarantino and then you just cranked him up times 10 or something like that. This is his own thing, right? Like he does it differently than anybody else does it. And reading back now, because it's, especially from the first one, I had reading it from some distance, I really enjoyed it. Just genuinely enjoyed it. It was a page turner for me. So and the reason why I liked it is because it's doing something different. And that's what art should do. You can't just completely go off the deep end. There is, it's creativity within a certain amount of constraint, but within that constraint, try to do something a little bit different. That's what makes it interesting for me.
Exactly. You mentioned Netflix, man. Like everybody in real life has been, you got to watch Stranger Things. You got to watch. Dude, I watched like the first 3 episodes. I was like, dude, this is fucking poop, dude. This show fucking blows. I'm a nostalgia guy, and it's just like hollow nostalgia with it's like product placement, like for the 80s, mixed with these kind of rehashed like storylines that aren't really. I didn't like. I thought it was gay. You know what I mean? I don't know.
Well, the nostalgia thing is like it's so overdone now, right? Like where everything's a reboot. Everything is like, going back to this particular time and things like that. And a lot of times it's the same fucking time. What about some shit like the revive some 90s shit? There's not much of that, is there? Revive some shit from the 40s or even the early 2000s or something like that. But it's always 80s. It's always, early 70s. And those were interesting times and everything like that. But I don't know. Some amount of nostalgia. I'm a very nostalgic person, but even I have my limits. You know what I mean? And it just seems like a lot of the nostalgia is just kind of like, it's almost like a seasoning, like, putting too much salt on like a dinner that's just shit and sucks. You know what I mean? It just isn't good. And no amount of nostalgia seasoning is going to spice it up kind of thing. So no, there's some very innovative stuff going on right now. Music, in literature, in visual arts and everything like that. And that's, you got to dig for this stuff. But there's I don't know. I eventually went there. I went into my old thing and that's just where I'm at. I guess I just hate everything that's fucking new except for a handful of things. There's a handful of things that I think are fucking amazing, but
I like 5 things, right? That's pretty much what it. But let me tell you guys, we're here like bemoaning, dude. There's like literally like an art revolution going on right now. Not just in like what me and Mike are doing with the the different books that we're putting out, or like just in ours. But dude, go like go on like YouTube and type in like cosmic horror indie films and see, like, there's literally hundreds of them, and a lot of them aren't that great, but dude, some of them are like, wow, that was great. There's so much good stuff. If you're looking for there's like metal, new wave of traditional heavy metal. There's doom and stoner rock going on right now. There's like the new wave of old school thrash metal. There's like so much cool shit, progressive rock coming out. There's like so much cool stuff. Tabletop games, you got the OSR movement. There's like literally like a revolution of art going on right now, and this idea that art's dead and there's no good entertainment. Let the conservatives sit on their thing and complain about how there's nothing good, because they're too fucking dumb and too milquetoast to come up with anything cool and interesting. Go look for it. It's everywhere, but you're not going to find it in the mainstream. Turn off your Netflix. Turn off Hollyweird, turn off all these like douchebags, and go check out the underground. It takes a little digging, as Mike said, but you're going to find some dope shit like Bizarchives, like Steelstorm, like, dude, you don't even got to go that far outside. You can just like dig around in our sphere and you'll find like people selling paintings and, selling albums, and there's like dope shit going on right now.
Yeah, absolutely. I think this is a good note to end it on. But I'll say this, if you get into the, dissident art scene, into the radical right wing, aesthetic scene, you could basically just like cancel your fucking Netflix and, stop paying your BBC, whatever the fuck it is over there that they pay. And you could have a lifetime of great art. There's enough people in our scene that are making good art that you could just consume that, and it's sufficient. That's enough for you, I think, right? There's just enough good stuff going on in our scene where you could just consume that, for the rest of your days, and you would have way fucking better art than you would if you were just like binging Netflix all day. So yeah, exactly. I know a lot of guys out there like getting bored with the way that like the dissident underground has become, and I'll be honest, I'm fucking bored with it too. Guys just like trying to be Johnny Hot Takes and come up with takes just to have hot takes, and like aren't even really meaningful. You got guys that are just like infighting and sniping each other just because they're bored. It's like, and then outrage porn and sharing these news headlines and everything like that. And let me tell you, dude, there's like, just turn that shit off, dude. A lot of this kind of stuff, and I'll be honest with you, a lot of this stuff in like the dissident spheres, the guys that are doing this shit, they're turning into fucking Hollywood and like it not being exciting or creative, and it just sucks. But there are guys that are doing it. So don't think that that's like the entirety of it. There's literally, I could name off the top of my head 10 dope just sci-fi books that you can buy that are fucking awesome. So just follow my Telegram, dude. I'm sharing the shit all the time. So fucking there's good stuff out there. Absolutely.
All right, let's close it up, Mr. Mike. It's we went on for 2 hours. Shout out to Mr. Thomas for coming on. He's such a smart guy. Buy Steelstorm, buy Bizarchives. Dude, I know a lot of you guys out there that are listening are probably already into some. You probably like Warhammer 40K and stuff like that. But there's a lot of dope stuff coming from our guys. So keep your eyes peeled, keep your ears to the ground, and check it out. Buy books, man. Buying books goes so far supporting us. So I know you guys, if you're listening right now, you already support Imperium Press by being signed up to the Gum Road. But if you're not already, make sure to go to imperiumpress.org/podcast and go sign up to the Gum Road and get some cool hardback books. So much great content there. So sign it up. Support Imperium Press, because they have a destiny. Mr. Mike has a destiny to fulfill and become anti-fragile and to become the institution that he was born to create. So support Imperium Press, support based publishing, support based art, and I'll see you guys next time on the next episode of Culture Dads.